My U-seam is pinned and ready to go. The back is pinned to the back, the front is pinned to the front, and I will sew this at 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'll start at the top of one of my edges and I'll line it up at 5/8 inch seam allowance. Let's zoom in to see what that looks like. So that's just 5/8 inch seam allowance, and you can see a little bit of an 8, so that's just 5/8. So I'm lined up. I'm going to back stitch and then sew all the way around my U. After I sew it one time, I'm going to go over everything for a second time so that I can make sure that this is really strong. This is a seam that I do not want to break, so I'm going to make sure to go over it twice to make it extra strong. There's my back stitching, and I'll just sew around. So I'm approaching my seam line right here, my 2 seam lines, and I want to make sure that they're still lined up on top of each other and that my seam allowance on both sides is laying open, which is why I pinned it down. So that can be a really helpful thing, is to pin down your seam allowance. And I'll just sew over it like normal, taking out the pins as I approach. Okay, now I've sewn my U one time. I'm just going to go back to the beginning and I'm going to sew the whole thing all over again. Before I sew it though, I just want to double check, and I'm just going to take where my 2 seams match up, and I'll look at the outside. I want to make sure that those line up pretty good, and you can see mine kind of just create another, it's like a cross, right? So these are my inseams and that's the U seam I just sewed. So I want to make sure there's a cross. If these 2 seams are not lining up, so they're more than 1/4 of an inch apart, then you could unpick this section and just fix that section before sewing it the second time, okay? But since mine looks okay, I'm going to go ahead and line up. I won't sew all the way through in the video, but just know I'm lining up at 5/8 seam allowance again. So you can see I'm just going to back stitch, and I'll sew over the whole thing just like I did a second time, just to make sure that everything's really strong, because I don't want the seam to come apart. So sew over it your second time and then move on.